The summer of 1832 had been merciless to the people of Ashbridge, Arkansas. The cotton fields lay withered under a relentless sun that seemed to burn with an unholy intensity, and the Ouachita River had dwindled to little more than a muddy trickle. Livestock died in the scorching heat, and children fell ill with fevers that no amount of prayer or medicine could break. It was in this desperate time that Reverend Ezekiel Thorne arrived in their small farming community, riding a black horse and carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a Bible bound in what appeared to be human skin. The townspeople, desperate for divine intervention, welcomed him with open arms when he offered to conduct a special service at the chapel of St. Ephraim, a small, weathered building that sat isolated on a hill overlooking the dying farmland. Martha Whitmore adjusted her bonnet as she walked alongside her husband Samuel and their 3 children toward the chapel. The morning air was already thick with humidity, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the early hour. Around them, the entire population of Ashbridge made their way up the dusty path. 89 souls in total, from newborn babies to elderly farmers whose backs were bent from decades of hard labor. "Mama, why does the preacher man's eyes look so strange?" whispered 7-year-old Lucy, tugging at Martha's worn calico dress. Martha glanced ahead at Reverend Thorne, who stood at the chapel's entrance greeting each family. There was something unsettling about his pale blue eyes. They seemed to look through people rather than at them, as if he could see something beyond the physical world that others could not. "Hush now, child," Martha murmured, though she too felt an inexplicable chill when the Reverend's gaze fell upon her family. "Show respect for the man of God." Samuel Whitmore removed his hat as they approached the chapel steps. The building itself seemed to emanate an odd energy. The wooden boards appeared darker than they should have been, and the small bell tower cast a shadow that seemed too long for the position of the sun. "Welcome, Brother Whitmore," Reverend Thorne said, his voice carrying a strange resonance that seemed to echo even in the open air. "The Lord has great plans for this congregation today." As the families filed into the chapel, the temperature seemed to drop several degrees despite the sweltering heat outside. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of the gathering, and somewhere in the rafters a murder of crows had settled, their black eyes watching the proceedings with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Old Henrik Johansson, the town's blacksmith, noticed that his pocket watch had stopped working the moment he crossed the threshold. Young Timothy Fletcher observed that the wildflowers his sweetheart had picked for the service began to wilt the instant they were brought inside. But these small oddities were dismissed in the face of their collective desperation for salvation from the drought and disease that plagued their community. Reverend Thorne took his place at the simple wooden pulpit, his pale hands gripping the edges as he surveyed his congregation. The morning light filtering through the chapel's windows seemed to bend around him, creating shadows that moved independently of his form. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice now carrying an otherworldly quality that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those present. "Today we shall speak of sacrifice, of devotion, and of the price that true faith demands." As he spoke these words, the chapel doors swung shut with a sound like thunder, though no wind stirred the air. The congregation turned in alarm, but found that the heavy wooden doors would not budge, as if they had been sealed from the outside by some invisible force. Martha Whitmore felt her youngest child, baby James, grow still in her arms. Looking down, she saw that his eyes had taken on the same pale blue hue as the Reverend's, and his tiny lips were moving in silent prayer to words he had never learned. The sermon was about to begin, and somewhere in the back of every mind present, a small voice whispered that this Sunday service would be unlike any other they had ever attended. The trapped congregation sat in stunned silence as Reverend Thorne opened his peculiar Bible. The pages seemed to flutter of their own accord, settling on passages written in a script that appeared to shift and writhe before their eyes. The air inside the chapel had grown thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of sulfur and something else, something organic and decay-sweet that made several of the children begin to whimper. "Fear not the darkness that comes before the light," Thorn intoned, his voice now seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "For in the deepest shadow we find the truest illumination." Samuel Whitmore tried to stand, his protective instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong, but found his body would not obey his commands. Around him, he could see other members of the congregation struggling against the same invisible force that held them in their pews like insects trapped in amber. The Reverend's sermon began to take on a hypnotic quality, his words weaving together in patterns that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to something primal and ancient within each listener. He spoke of a faith that transcended the physical world, of a devotion so pure that it required the complete surrender of earthly existence. "The Lord demands not just your worship," Thorn continued, his pale eyes now glowing with an inner light that cast no illumination on his surroundings, "but your very essence, your life force, your eternal souls offered willingly upon his altar." As he spoke, the temperature in the chapel continued to drop, and frost began to form on the windows despite the blazing heat outside. The congregation's breath became visible in small puffs of vapor, and several of the elderly members began to shiver uncontrollably. Young Mary Hutchinson, barely 16 and newly married, felt her wedding ring begin to burn against her finger. Looking down in alarm, she saw that the simple gold band was turning black, as if being consumed by some invisible fire. Around her, other members of the congregation were experiencing similar phenomena: jewelry tarnishing, clothing beginning to fray and tear, hair turning white at the roots. The Reverend's Bible had begun to emit a low humming sound, and the pages were now turning themselves, revealing passages written in what appeared to be fresh blood. The words seemed to leap from the page and hang in the air before each member of the congregation, burning themselves into their minds with searing clarity. "Blessed are those who give all," the floating words proclaimed, "for they shall inherit not the earth, but something far greater, eternal unity with the divine darkness that dwells between the stars." Henrik Johansson, despite his fear, managed to force his eyes toward the chapel's windows. What he saw there made his blood run cold. The outside world was no longer visible. Instead, the windows showed only an endless void, filled with swirling shadows and distant alien lights that hurt to look upon directly. The children in the congregation had stopped crying. In fact, they had stopped moving altogether, sitting with their eyes fixed on the Reverend, with expressions of rapture that seemed far too mature for their young faces. Baby James Whitmore had begun to speak, though the words that came from his infant lips were in a language that predated human civilization. "The time of choosing has come," Reverend Thorn announced, raising his arms toward the chapel's ceiling. As he did so, the wooden beams began to crack and splinter, revealing not the sky beyond, but the same endless void that now filled the windows. "Who among you will step forward and demonstrate the depth of your faith?" To the horror of the congregation, several members began to rise from their pews, moving with jerky, puppet-like motions toward the altar. Their faces bore expressions of blissful serenity, but their eyes reflected a terror so profound that it seemed to echo from the depths of their souls. Martha Whitmore watched in helpless anguish as her eldest son, 14-year-old Matthew, stood and began walking toward the front of the chapel. She tried to scream, to reach out for him, but her voice had been stolen and her body remained frozen in place. The altar itself had begun to change, the simple wooden structure expanding and reshaping itself into something that defied geometric logic. Symbols appeared carved into its surface, symbols that seemed to move and shift when observed directly, causing those who looked upon them to feel their sanity beginning to fray at the edges. As the first of the chosen congregation members reached the altar, Reverend Thorn smiled, revealing teeth that were no longer quite human. The real ceremony was about to begin, and the price of faith was about to be collected in full. The first to reach the altar was old Jeremiah Cobb, the town's miller, whose weathered hands trembled as he placed them upon the transformed wooden surface. The moment his skin made contact with the strange symbols, his body convulsed, and a sound escaped his lips. Not quite a scream, not quite a prayer, but something that seemed to come from the very core of his being. The congregation watched in paralyzed horror as Jeremiah's form began to shimmer and fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. His eyes rolled back, showing only white, and his mouth opened impossibly wide as something, his essence, his soul, was drawn out of him in a stream of silvery light that flowed directly into the altar's carved symbols. "Behold," Reverend Thorne proclaimed, his voice now echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from the void beyond the chapel walls. "The first offering is accepted. See how willingly he gives of himself for the greater glory." Martha Whitmore felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her son Matthew continue his inexorable march toward the altar. Around her, other family members were rising. The Hutchinson twins, young Sarah Fletcher, even elderly Mrs. Pemberton, who had been confined to a wheelchair for the past 3 years, but now walked with steady, purposeful steps. The air in the chapel had become thick as syrup, making each breath a struggle. The frost on the windows had spread to cover the walls, and strange patterns were forming in the ice, patterns that resembled the same alien symbols now glowing on the altar's surface. Samuel Whitmore summoned every ounce of his strength and managed to force out a single word: "Stop." But his voice was barely a whisper, and Reverend Thorne turned to him with a smile that split his face from ear to ear. "You misunderstand the nature of this blessing, Brother Whitmore," the Reverend said, his form beginning to waver and shift like heat shimmer. "Your son is not being taken. He is being elevated. He is becoming part of something infinitely greater than his mortal flesh could ever contain." As Matthew reached the altar, the boy turned to face his family one last time. His young face bore an expression of profound peace, but his eyes held a terror so deep that it seemed to reach across the space between them and claw at his parents' hearts. "I understand now, Papa," Matthew said, his voice carrying the same otherworldly resonance as the Reverend's. "I understand what we're meant to become." The boy placed his hands on the altar, and the process began again. But this time, as the silvery essence was drawn from his body, something else became visible. Dark tendrils that seemed to emerge from the void beyond the chapel, wrapping around each member of the congregation like invisible chains. Henrik Johansson realized with growing horror that they weren't just witnessing a ceremony, they were all part of it. Every person in the chapel was connected to the altar by these shadow tendrils, and their life force was slowly being siphoned away, one soul at a time. The Reverend's Bible had begun to levitate, its pages turning rapidly as new text appeared. Text that seemed to be writing itself in real time, documenting the names and essence of each person as they were consumed. The book was recording their souls, binding them to whatever dark purpose this ritual served. Young Lucy Whitmore, despite her terror, noticed something that the adults had missed. The crows in the rafters weren't just watching, they were counting. Each time someone was consumed by the altar, one of the black birds would let out a single, sharp cry, as if marking another tally in some cosmic ledger. The temperature had dropped so low that ice was forming on the congregation's clothing and hair. Several of the elderly members had stopped breathing altogether, though they remained upright in their pews, their eyes still fixed on the altar with expressions of religious ecstasy. As more souls were harvested, the chapel itself began to change. The walls stretched upward, defying the building's original architecture, and the ceiling opened completely to reveal not the Arkansas sky, but a swirling maelstrom of darkness, punctuated by stars that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. Reverend Thorne's human disguise was beginning to slip, His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his limbs seemed to be elongating, becoming more angular and insectoid. When he spoke now, his voice carried undertones that suggested multiple beings speaking in unison. "The harvest is bountiful," he announced to the void above. 89 souls, freely given in the name of faith. The compact is nearly complete. Martha Whitmore felt the shadow tendril connected to her growing stronger, more insistent. Her vision was beginning to blur at the edges, and she could feel her life force being slowly drawn away. But in her fading consciousness, she managed to focus on one crucial detail. The Reverend had said, "nearly complete, not complete." Something was still missing from his dark ritual, and in that small gap lay the only hope for salvation that remained. As the supernatural harvest continued, Martha Whitmore clung to that single word, nearly like a drowning woman grasping a rope. Through her dimming vision, she watched as more members of the congregation were drawn to the altar, their souls feeding whatever cosmic hunger the ritual was meant to satisfy. But something was wrong with the process, some element that wasn't proceeding as Reverend Thorne had planned. The answer came to her as she watched baby James in her arms. Unlike the other children who had been called to the altar, her infant son remained with her, his tiny body warm against her chest, even as the chapel's temperature plummeted toward freezing. His eyes, though they had taken on that unsettling pale blue hue, still held a spark of something that the others had lost. Innocence, perhaps, or a purity that the dark ritual couldn't quite touch. Henrik Johansson, fighting against the growing lethargy that threatened to claim his consciousness, noticed a similar anomaly. His granddaughter Emma, only 3 years old, sat in her mother's lap just 2 pews ahead, and she alone among the children seemed to be resisting the call to the altar. Her small hands were pressed together in prayer, and her lips moved in the simple bedtime prayer her grandmother had taught her. The realization struck both adults simultaneously. The ritual required willing sacrifice, souls given freely in faith. But true innocence, the kind possessed by the very young who had not yet learned to question or doubt, could not be corrupted in the same way. Their faith was pure, untainted by the complex theological manipulations that Thorne was using to ensnare the adult minds. Reverend Thorne seemed to sense this resistance. His elongated form turned toward the remaining children, and his voice took on a more urgent, commanding tone. "Come, little ones," he called, his words dripping with false sweetness. "Come and join your families in eternal bliss." But baby James began to cry, not the wail of an infant, but something that sounded almost like a hymn, a pure note that seemed to cut through the oppressive atmosphere of the chapel like a blade. Other young children began to join in, their voices creating a harmony that made the shadow tendrils recoil and the alien symbols on the altar flicker and dim. Martha felt strength returning to her limbs as the tendril connected to her loosened its grip. Around the chapel, other parents who still had young children with them began to stir, their own connections to the dark ritual weakening in the face of their children's pure faith. Samuel Whitmore managed to stand, his legs shaking but his resolve firm. "You're not taking them," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You can't have them." Thorne's inhuman features contorted with rage. "They belong to the covenant now," he snarled, his multiple voices creating a discordant chorus. "All who entered this sacred space have pledged themselves to the eternal darkness." "No," said a new voice, weak but determined. It was Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly woman who had walked to the altar despite her infirmity. She stood at the altar's edge, her hand hovering just above its surface, but she had not yet made contact. "I remember now. I remember what real faith feels like." The old woman turned to face the congregation, her eyes clear and bright, despite the supernatural forces swirling around her. "This isn't God's work," she declared. "This is something else, something that feeds on our desperation and calls it devotion. Her words seemed to break a spell that had been cast over the remaining congregation. Those who had not yet been consumed began to stir, their minds clearing as they remembered who they truly were and what they truly believed. Reverend Thorne let out a shriek that shattered the chapel's remaining windows, sending shards of ice-covered glass cascading to the floor. His human disguise fell away completely, revealing something that belonged to the spaces between stars, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that wore the shape of a man like an ill-fitting coat. "You cannot resist," the thing that had been Thorne howled. "The compact is sealed. The harvest must be completed." But the children's hymn grew louder, joined now by the voices of their parents and the other survivors. It was a simple song, one they had all learned in childhood, "Jesus loves me," but sung with a faith so pure and unshakable that it seemed to push back against the very fabric of the nightmare that surrounded them. The alien symbols on the altar began to crack and fade. The void beyond the chapel's broken ceiling started to recede, revealing glimpses of the Arkansas sky. And for the first time since the doors had slammed shut, there was hope. But the battle for their souls was far from over, and the entity that had masqueraded as a man of God was not yet ready to release its claim on the congregation of St. Ephraim. The entity's true form writhed and expanded, filling the space above the altar with tendrils of living shadow that lashed out at the singing congregation. Where the darkness touched them, it left marks like burns. But the hymn continued, growing stronger as more voices joined the chorus of resistance. Martha Whitmore held baby James close, his innocent voice somehow carrying above all the others, despite his age. The child's pure faith seemed to act as a beacon, drawing the other survivors together and strengthening their resolve. Around her, she could see the shadow tendrils that had bound them to the ritual beginning to fray and dissolve, but their victory was coming at a terrible cost. Those who had already been consumed by the altar, including her beloved son Matthew, remained trapped in a state between life and death, their translucent forms hovering around the transformed altar like moths drawn to a flame. Their eyes pleaded for release, but they seemed unable to break free from whatever force held them. Henrik Johansson, his blacksmith's instincts telling him to fight with more than just song, grabbed one of the heavy wooden pews and hurled it at the writhing mass above the altar. The furniture passed harmlessly through the entity's form, but the act of defiance seemed to inspire others. Samuel Whitmore picked up his fallen hat and placed it firmly on his head, a simple gesture of human dignity in the face of cosmic horror. "You want our souls?" Samuel called out to the entity. "Then you'll have to take them from us by force. We won't give them freely to your lies." The creature's response was a sound like reality tearing. The chapel walls began to buckle and warp, and the floor beneath their feet started to crack, revealing glimpses of the same endless void that had consumed the windows. But the congregation held firm, their hymn creating a bubble of sanctity in the midst of the supernatural storm. Mrs. Pemberton, still standing at the altar's edge, reached out toward the trapped souls of the consumed. "Come back to us," she called to them. "Remember who you are. Remember what you truly believe." Young Matthew Whitmore's translucent form turned toward her voice, his face showing a flicker of recognition. Other trapped souls began to stir, their connection to the altar wavering as they heard the familiar hymn and remembered their earthly lives. The entity sensed its hold weakening and made one final desperate attempt to complete its harvest. It focused all its malevolent attention on the youngest children, sending waves of psychic pressure that would have crushed adult minds. But the children's faith remained unshakable, their innocent trust in divine protection acting as an impenetrable shield. Baby James reached out with one tiny hand toward his brother's trapped soul, and something miraculous happened. A thread of pure light connected them, and Matthew's form began to solidify, becoming more real and less ethereal with each passing moment. "The bond of family," Mrs. Pemberton whispered, understanding flooding her aged features. Love is stronger than whatever dark covenant this thing tried to forge. One by one, the trapped souls began to reconnect with their living family members. Parents reached out to children, spouses to each other, friends to friends, and each connection weakened the entity's hold on them. The altar began to crack and crumble, its alien symbols fading as the power that had sustained them was drained away. The entity let out one final shriek of rage and frustration before beginning to collapse in on itself. The void beyond the chapel's broken ceiling started to close, and the normal laws of physics began to reassert themselves. The temperature rose, the frost melted, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the building began to lift. But as the supernatural forces retreated, the chapel itself began to collapse. The building had been so thoroughly corrupted by the entity's presence that it could no longer maintain its structural integrity. Beams crashed down, walls buckled, and the floor gave way in several places. "Everyone out!" Henrik Johansson bellowed, his voice cutting through the chaos. "The building's coming down!" The congregation, both living and newly restored, rushed toward the doors that had been sealed shut for what felt like hours, but had actually been only minutes. The heavy wooden barriers swung open easily now, revealing the blessed sight of the Arkansas countryside, bathed in normal morning sunlight. As they stumbled out of the collapsing chapel, Martha Whitmore counted heads frantically. 89 souls had entered the building that morning, and by some miracle 89 souls emerged, though all bore the invisible scars of their encounter with something that should not exist in the rational world. Behind them, the chapel of St. Ephraim collapsed completely, leaving only a pile of rubble and the lingering scent of sulfur. But carved into one of the fallen stones, barely visible unless one knew where to look, was a single handprint, scorched deep into the rock as if by intense heat. The congregation stood in the morning sun, alive and whole, but forever changed by their brush with cosmic horror. They had learned that faith could be both a weapon and a shield, but also that there were things in the universe that would try to corrupt even the most sacred beliefs for their own dark purposes. 3 days after the collapse of the chapel of St. Ephraim, state officials arrived in Ashbridge to investigate reports of the incident. They found a community in shock, 89 people who all told the same impossible story about a demonic entity masquerading as a preacher and a ritual that had nearly claimed their souls. The officials, practical men who dealt in facts and evidence rather than supernatural tales, quickly dismissed the accounts as mass hysteria brought on by the extreme heat and the stress of the ongoing drought. They documented the collapse of the chapel as a structural failure caused by the building's age and the unusual weather conditions, noting that it was fortunate no one had been seriously injured in the incident. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, the state's chief investigator, was particularly skeptical of the congregation's claims. A man of science and reason, he attributed their shared delusion to a combination of religious fervor, environmental stress, and the psychological phenomenon of collective suggestion. In his official report, he wrote, "The citizens of Ashbridge have clearly suffered a shared psychological episode, likely triggered by the extreme weather conditions and their desperate circumstances. No evidence of supernatural activity has been found, but Dr. Blackwood was a thorough man, and something about the case nagged at him. The consistency of the witnesses' accounts was unusual for mass hysteria, and there were certain physical details that didn't quite fit his rational explanation. The scorched handprint in the stone, for instance, showed signs of heat damage that far exceeded what any normal fire could produce. The strange symbols that several witnesses claimed to have seen carved into the altar were described in identical detail by people who had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. Most troubling of all was the discovery of a leather-bound journal hidden beneath the chapel's collapsed pulpit. The journal belonged to one Reverend Ezekiel Thorne, and its contents made for disturbing reading. The entries, written in a spidery hand that seemed to shift and change when observed directly, detailed a series of similar incidents across the American frontier, small communities where entire congregations had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty churches and unexplained phenomena. The journal's final entry, dated the morning of the Ashbridge incident, read, "The harvest approaches completion. 89 souls have been prepared for the offering, their faith corrupted and redirected toward the true masters who dwell in the spaces between stars. Soon, the gateway will open, and the ancient compact will be fulfilled. The faithful shall be rewarded with eternal servitude, and the cosmos shall know a new order." Dr. Blackwood found himself faced with a choice: report the journal's contents and risk his professional reputation, or suppress the evidence and maintain the official narrative of mass hysteria. After much deliberation, he chose a middle path. He filed the journal away in the state archives, classified it as evidence of religious extremism, and made sure it would be buried so deep in bureaucratic red tape that it would likely never see the light of day again. The people of Ashbridge, meanwhile, struggled to return to their normal lives. The drought broke within a week of the chapel's collapse, bringing blessed rain to their parched fields. The children who had fallen ill with mysterious fevers recovered completely, and the livestock that had been dying began to thrive once more. It was as if the land itself had been cleansed of some malevolent influence, but the survivors of St. Ephraim were forever changed. They spoke little of what they had experienced, even among themselves, but they maintained a vigilance that bordered on paranoia. They watched for signs of corruption in their community, for strangers who seemed too interested in matters of faith, for any indication that the darkness they had faced might return. Martha Whitmore kept baby James close at all times, never forgetting how his innocent faith had helped save them all. Samuel Whitmore became the town's unofficial guardian, organizing watch groups and maintaining a careful record of everyone who came and went from Ashbridge. Henrik Johansson forged a set of iron crosses for each family, claiming that cold iron had protective properties against supernatural threats. Years passed, and the incident at St. Ephraim became local legend, then folklore, then finally just another ghost story told around campfires. The official records remained sealed, and Dr. Blackwood took the secret of Reverend Thorne's journal to his grave. But in 1924, nearly a century after the events at Ashbridge, a young historian named Eleanor Marsh discovered a reference to the incident while researching frontier religious movements. Her investigation led her to the state archives, where she managed to locate Dr. Blackwood's suppressed files. What she found there would change her life forever and set in motion a new chapter in the dark legacy of St. Ephraim. The journal of Reverend Ezekiel Thorne contained more than just the account of the Ashbridge incident. It included detailed maps marking dozens of locations across the American frontier where similar rituals had been attempted, along with cryptic references to a grand convergence that would occur when enough souls had been harvested to open a permanent gateway between dimensions. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Ashbridge had not been an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of supernatural predation that had been systematically covered up by authorities who either couldn't comprehend the truth or chose to suppress it for the greater good. The entity that had called itself Reverend Thorne was still out there, still working toward its cosmic agenda, and the failed ritual at St. Ephraim was just one setback in a campaign that spanned decades. As she delved deeper into the mystery, Eleanor began to notice that she was being watched. Strange figures appeared at the edges of her vision, and her dreams were filled with visions of empty churches and scorched handprints. She realized that by uncovering the truth about St. Ephraim, she had drawn the attention of forces that preferred their secrets to remain buried. The legacy of the Chapel of St. Ephraim lived on, a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to be spoken aloud, and that the price of faith can sometimes be higher than any mortal soul should be asked to pay. In the end, The 89 people who vanished during that religious service had not truly disappeared. They had simply been transformed into guardians of a secret that could never be allowed to see the light of day. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, something ancient and hungry continued to wait for its next opportunity to harvest the souls of the faithful, knowing that human nature would always provide new congregations ready to believe in salvation, no matter how terrible the cost.